The distant cry of a hawk pierced the silence as Caleb Xanders pulled his horse to a stop atop the windswept ridge, gazing across the vast Montana territory with eyes as weathered as the leather of his saddle. The year was 1876, and for 15 years he'd wandered these wild lands alone, a shadow moving through a world that had never quite seemed to have a place for him. The sunset painted the rolling plains in hues of amber and gold, stretching toward the jagged silhouette of mountains on the horizon. Caleb adjusted his worn Stetson and patted the neck of his loyal buckskin stallion, Storm. "Another night under the stars, old friend," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Conversations with his horse had become his primary social interaction over the years, punctuated only by occasional encounters in frontier towns where he'd trade furs, pick up supplies, or deliver messages between settlements. The life of a courier in these parts wasn't glamorous, but it suited him. No roots to put down, no attachments to form, no disappointments to endure. Just endless miles of open country and the freedom to disappear whenever the walls of civilization began closing in. Caleb made camp as darkness fell, building a small fire and preparing his meager supper of beans and jerky. As flames cast dancing shadows across his face, he pulled out a small, worn journal and made a brief entry with a stubby pencil. The date, his location, and a few terse observations about the weather and terrain. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. He'd long ago learned to keep his thoughts to himself, even in the privacy of his own journal. Feelings were dangerous things to acknowledge, let alone commit to paper. Better to focus on facts, on survival, on the next destination. Tomorrow would bring him to Portland, Oregon, where he had a package to deliver from a businessman in Boise. It wasn't his usual territory, but the pay was good, and Caleb had learned long ago not to be picky about work. Money meant supplies, and supplies meant freedom to keep moving. His thoughts drifted as he sipped his coffee, recalling vague memories of a home he'd left behind in Pennsylvania after the war. A father who'd returned from battle a broken man, a mother whose tears couldn't wash away the family's troubles, and a younger brother who'd needed more than Caleb had been able to give. Letters had stopped coming years ago, and he'd stopped sending them not long after. Some bridges burned too completely to rebuild. Portland, he said aloud, testing the name on his tongue as Storm's ears twitched in response. In and out quick, that's the plan. If only plans in life worked out as neatly as they looked in a man's mind. Morning came with a chill that seeped through Caleb's wool blanket. He rose with the sun, moving through his routine with practiced efficiency. By the time the first rays of light were stretching across the countryside, he was already miles closer to his destination. Portland, nestled alongside the Willamette River, had grown considerably since its founding decades earlier. What had once been little more than a clearing in the forest was now a bustling frontier city with aspirations of greatness. Caleb approached with his usual caution, observing the town from a distance before committing to enter. Wooden buildings lined the muddy streets, with horses hitched to posts and townspeople going about their business. A pair of children chased each other down the boardwalk, nearly colliding with a well-dressed businessman who scowled in their direction. Near the general store, two old-timers sat on a bench, whittling and exchanging what looked to be tall tales. Normal. Peaceful. No obvious trouble that would complicate his task. Caleb urged Storm forward, the clip-clop of hooves on packed earth drawing a few curious glances. Newcomers were always noticed in towns like this, especially ones who looked like him, trail-worn, unshaven, with eyes that never quite relaxed. He located the offices of Harrison Mercantile with little difficulty and dismounted, tying Storm to the hitching post. The package he carried was tucked securely inside his saddlebag, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the elements. What it contained wasn't his business. He was paid to deliver, not to inquire. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, and a balding man behind the counter looked up from his ledger. "Help you, stranger?" he asked, setting his pen aside. "Package for Mr. Harrison from Boys," Caleb replied, retrieving the parcel. "Need his signature." "That would be me." The man stood, adjusting his spectacles. "Thomas Harrison. Been expecting this. Jacob Fulton send you." Caleb nodded, placing the package on the counter and extracting a folded paper from his pocket. "Sign here." As Harrison scrawled his name, Caleb glanced around the shop, cataloging exits and noting the expensive merchandise locked behind glass cabinets. The place spoke of wealth and connections beyond the typical frontier establishment. "You've made good time," Harrison observed, handing back the signed receipt. "Fulton's letter said you departed only 10 days ago. I travel light." "Indeed. Well, your payment." Harrison counted out several gold coins. "As agreed, plus a little extra for the prompt delivery." Caleb pocketed the money with a nod of acknowledgement but said nothing more. The less conversation, the better. He turned to leave, plans already forming for a quick meal, perhaps a bath, and then back on the trail by nightfall. "Mister, I don't believe I caught your name," Harrison called after him. "Xanders. Caleb Xanders." "Mr. Xanders, since you've completed your task ahead of schedule, might I interest you in another commission? I have sensitive documents that need transport to Seattle. The usual courier I employ has fallen ill, and this cannot wait." Caleb hesitated at the threshold. Seattle meant at least another week of travel, possibly more depending on weather and trail conditions. But it also meant more money and a reason to keep moving. "When would you need these delivered?" he asked. "Within the fortnight, if possible. I'd pay handsomely, of course." Harrison moved closer, lowering his voice. "Double your current fee." The sum was substantial enough to give Caleb pause. With that much money, he could replace some of his worn gear, perhaps even take a few weeks off from courier work to hunt and trap in the mountains when the weather turned. Freedom in the only form he recognized it. "I'd need to resupply first," he said finally. Harrison's face brightened. "Excellent. The documents won't be ready until tomorrow morning. That gives you time to rest and prepare. Return at 9 and all will be arranged." With a curt nod, Caleb left the mercantile, his plans for a quick departure now delayed. He untied Storm and led the horse down the street toward the livery stable. An unexpected extension to his stay in Portland wasn't ideal, but the money made it worthwhile. The livery owner, a grizzled man named Jenkins, took charge of Storm with promises of good feed and a thorough grooming. Caleb paid in advance, gathered his personal belongings, and headed for the hotel. The Golden Eagle wasn't fancy, but it offered clean rooms and privacy, two things Caleb valued above luxuries. After securing lodging for 2 nights, he made his way to the bathhouse. The hot water was a luxury he rarely indulged in, but the grime of the trail clung to him like a second skin, and the prospect of negotiating business in the morning made cleanliness a necessity rather than a preference. Later, freshly bathed and shaved, dressed in the cleanest clothes from his pack, Caleb sat in a corner of the hotel's dining room, a plate of roast beef and potatoes before him. He ate methodically, watching the other patrons from beneath the brim of his hat, listening to conversations without appearing to do so. Local gossip held little interest for him, but information about trail conditions, law enforcement movements, or bandit activity could prove valuable. So far, he'd heard nothing of concern, just the usual talk of politics, business dealings, and social affairs. His meal nearly finished, Caleb's attention was drawn to a commotion at the entrance of the dining room. A woman stood there, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the hotel manager. "I understand your concern, Mr. Walters, but I assure you the arrangements have been made," she was saying, her voice firm yet cultured. "If you'll simply check your ledger again, miss, as I've told you 3 times now, there's no reservation under the name Neville," the manager replied, exasperation evident in his tone. "And we're fully booked for the night. The logging conference has brought folks from all over the territory." The woman, Miss Neville, apparently drew herself up with dignity. She was striking, Caleb noted dispassionately, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and a traveling suit of deep green that complemented her fair complexion. Not a local, judging by her accent and attire. "Then perhaps you could direct me to another establishment. It's growing late, and I'm unfamiliar with Portland." The manager's expression softened slightly. "I wish I could help, miss, but as I said, the conference has filled every respectable hotel in town. The only rooms available would be above the saloons, and those are not suitable for a lady traveling alone." A flash of frustration crossed her face, quickly replaced by determination. "I see. Then I shall have to improvise. Thank you for your time." She turned to leave, and Caleb returned his attention to his meal, the brief drama already dismissed from his thoughts. The problems of strangers were not his concern. He had his own plans to finalize for the morning. He was just signaling for coffee when the hotel manager approached his table. "Pardon the interruption, sir, but might I have a word?" Caleb looked up, his expression neutral. "What about?" The manager leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The lady you just saw, Miss Neville, she's in quite a predicament. Traveled all the way from Boston to meet her uncle, only to find he's been called away unexpectedly. Left her with a letter of introduction but nowhere to stay. And this concerns me how." Caleb's tone wasn't unfriendly, merely direct. "Well, you see, you've paid for a room with 2 beds being all that was available, and since you're traveling alone—" The manager trailed off suggestively. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to share my room with a strange woman." "Not share exactly, more like relinquish half of what you've paid for, at a discounted rate, of course," the manager added hastily. "She'd take 1 bed, you the other, with a screen between for propriety. She's a lady of quality, sir, not some—" "No," Caleb interrupted flatly. "Find another solution." The manager sighed. "I've tried, believe me. But as I told the lady, every decent room in Portland is taken. The only alternatives are places no respectable woman should enter, let alone spend the night." Caleb took a sip of his coffee, considering. He had no desire for company, especially female company with its attendant complications. But he also recognized a simple truth. If their situations were reversed, he'd hope some stranger might show similar consideration to his own sister or mother. "She'd pay her own way?" he asked finally. "Of course. Half the room rate refunded to you directly," Caleb sighed, already regretting what he was about to say. "Fine, but I leave early tomorrow. Make sure she understands that." Relief washed over the manager's face. "Absolutely, thank you, sir. I'll inform Miss Neville immediately." As the manager hurried away, Caleb finished his coffee in contemplative silence. One night of inconvenience, then back to his solitary existence. A small price to pay for good karma, if such a thing existed. 20 minutes later, he was unlocking his hotel room door, aware of the woman following a few paces behind with the manager. The room was modest but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a small writing desk by the window. "As you can see, Miss Neville, the accommodations are quite respectable," the manager was saying. Mr. Xanders has graciously agreed to share the room with all proper arrangements for privacy. The woman, Miss Neville, looked simultaneously relieved and apprehensive as she surveyed the space. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. I assure you I'll be no trouble." Caleb nodded curtly, moving to the bed farthest from the door. "I'll be leaving at dawn," he said, unpacking only what he needed for the night. "Manager says there's a screen." "Yes, of course." The manager bustled out and returned moments later with a folding screen, which he positioned between the beds. "There we are. Most suitable." After a few more assurances and expressions of gratitude, the manager departed, leaving Caleb alone with his unexpected roommate. An uncomfortable silence fell. "I truly appreciate this kindness," she said finally, setting her small traveling case on the vacant bed. "I realize it's an imposition." "It's one night," Caleb replied, his back to her as he arranged his gear. "We'll both survive." He heard a soft laugh behind him. "That's quite the ringing endorsement, Mr. Xanders. I promise not to disturb your slumber with excessive snoring or sleepwalking." Despite himself, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. There was a spark of humor in her voice that suggested she wasn't as prim as her appearance indicated. "Appreciated," he said, turning slightly. "Miss Rebecca Neville," she supplied, removing her hat and setting it aside. A few strands of her auburn hair had escaped their pins, framing a face that Caleb now noticed held intelligent green eyes and a determined chin. "Recently of Boston, though I was raised in New York." Caleb nodded, acknowledging the introduction without offering more about himself. He moved to the window, checking that it could be opened if needed, an old habit born of years spent evaluating escape routes. "And what brings you to our rugged wilderness, Miss Neville?" he asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "Family matters," the manager mentioned. Rebecca hesitated, as if weighing how much to share with a stranger. "My uncle, my father's brother, relocated here some years ago. With both my parents now gone, he's my only remaining family. I've come to Portland to build a new life, I suppose." There was something in her tone, a careful neutrality that made Caleb suspect there was more to her story than she was revealing. Not that it mattered. By this time tomorrow, they'd be nothing more than a brief memory in each other's lives. "Portland's growing," he commented. "Plenty of opportunity for those willing to adapt." "And you, Mr. Xanders, are you a resident of Portland?" Caleb shook his head. "Just passing through." "I deliver things from one place to another." "A courier," she noted. "That must be interesting work. You must see so much of the country." "It's a job," he replied, uncomfortable with her interest. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for tomorrow." Understanding his dismissal, Rebecca nodded and turned to her own unpacking, respecting the boundaries he'd established. Caleb retreated to his side of the screen, removing his boots and outer clothing before stretching out on the bed, fully intending to be gone before she woke in the morning. Sleep, however, proved elusive. The unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about, breathing, existing in his space kept him alert despite his exhaustion. He listened as Rebecca readied herself for bed, the rustle of fabric and soft footsteps creating a domestic rhythm that felt alien after so many years of solitude. "Good night, Mr. Xanders," came her quiet voice from beyond the screen after the lamp was extinguished. Caleb stared into the darkness. "Good night, Miss Neville." Dawn found him already dressed and ready, his few possessions packed away with the efficiency of long practice. He moved silently, mindful of the sleeping woman on the other side of the screen. For a moment, he paused, considering whether to leave some sort of farewell note, but quickly dismissed the idea as unnecessary sentimentality. Their paths had crossed briefly and would now diverge permanently. The hotel was quiet as he made his way downstairs, settling his account with the drowsy clerk before heading to the livery. Storm greeted him with a soft nickering, looking refreshed from the good care he'd received. "Ready for the trail again, old friend," Caleb murmured, saddling the buckskin with practiced movements. The streets of Portland were just beginning to stir as he rode toward Harrison Mercantile, morning mist still clinging to the cobblestones. A few early workers nodded greetings as he passed, but Caleb kept his responses to the minimum required by courtesy. Better not to encourage familiarity. Harrison was waiting when he arrived, a leather portfolio in hand. "Ah, Mr. Xanders, punctual as expected. The documents are prepared and sealed. They must be delivered directly to Mr. Edward Blackwell in Seattle, no intermediaries." Caleb took the portfolio, securing it in his saddlebag. "Any trouble I should know about?" Harrison hesitated. "Not trouble precisely, but these papers are valuable. There are those who might wish to intercept them, hence the generous payment." He handed over a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. Caleb weighed the pouch in his palm before tucking it safely away. "Consider it done." With business concluded, he turned Storm toward the northern road out of town. The morning was clear, promising good traveling weather, and if luck held, he could make 20 miles before nightfall. Seattle waited, and after that, well, there was always another horizon. He'd barely reached the edge of town when he heard someone calling his name. Turning in the saddle, he was surprised to see Rebecca Neville hurrying toward him, skirts gathered in one hand to avoid the morning dew. "Mr. Xanders, a moment, please," she called, slightly breathless from her pursuit. Puzzled, Caleb reined Storm to a halt and waited for her to approach. "Miss Neville, something wrong?" She shook her head, regaining her composure. "Not wrong, no. But after you left, I realized you'd paid for the entire night at the hotel, yet I only refunded half. It didn't seem right." She extended her hand, offering several coins. The gesture caught him off guard. In his experience, most people were quick to take advantage of oversights that benefited them. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it a welcome to Portland." "That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he interrupted. "I've been paid well for my next job. It's nothing." Rebecca studied him for a moment, then slowly withdrew her hand. "Very well, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I understand from the manager that you're traveling to Seattle." Caleb nodded, already growing restless with the delay. "That's right. I don't suppose—" She faltered, then squared her shoulders. "My uncle, the one I came to meet, has been called to Seattle on unexpected business. That's why he wasn't here to receive me. If you're heading that way, might I accompany you? I would pay, of course." Caleb stared at her in disbelief. "You want to travel with me? To Seattle, alone?" "Not entirely alone," she pointed out. "There would be two of us. Miss Neville, I'm a stranger. For all you know, I could be dangerous." A small smile played at her lips. "Mr. Xanders, if you were the type of man to take advantage of a woman, you had ample opportunity last night. Instead, you were a perfect gentleman, albeit a rather taciturn one." Despite her logic, Caleb shook his head. "It's rough country between here and Seattle. No place for a lady traveling without proper escort. And yet, it's country I must traverse if I'm to reunite with my only family," she countered. "I can ride, Mr. Xanders, and I'm stronger than I appear. I won't slow you down. Do you even have a horse?" he asked, grasping at practical objections. "I can purchase one, or hire one if that's preferable for a journey of this length." Caleb ran a hand over his face, frustrated by her persistence. "Miss Neville, why not simply take the stage coach? It's safer, more comfortable, and won't depart for another week, according to the schedule I consulted this morning," she finished for him. "My uncle's letter indicated he has matters of some urgency to discuss with me. I'd rather not delay." Looking at her determined expression, Caleb recognized the futility of further argument. She would find her way to Seattle with or without him, and at least in his company, she'd have some protection from the hazards of the trail. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly, "but we leave within the hour. I'll help you find a suitable mount at the livery, and you follow my instructions without question. The trail isn't forgiving of mistakes." Relief washed over Rebecca's features. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. I'll gather my things immediately and meet you at the livery stable." She turned to hurry back toward the hotel, then paused. "And I promise not to be a burden." Caleb watched her go, a sense of foreboding settling in his chest. 15 years of riding alone, making his own decisions, answering to no one, all disrupted by a chance encounter with a determined woman from the East. "This is a mistake," he muttered to Storm, who flicked an ear in what seemed like agreement. Yet an hour later, Caleb found himself watching as Rebecca examined a sturdy chestnut mare at the livery stable. She moved with surprising confidence around the animal, checking its legs, inspecting its teeth, and even running a hand along its back to assess its condition. "She'll do nicely," Rebecca declared after completing her inspection. "Healthy, well-tempered, and used to long journeys, if I'm not mistaken." Jenkins, the livery owner, looked impressed. "You know your horses, miss?" "My father bred carriage horses in New York," she explained, stroking the mare's nose. "I spent more time in the stables than in the drawing room, much to my mother's dismay." Caleb observed the exchange with guarded interest. Perhaps she wouldn't be as much of a liability as he'd feared. Still, the wilderness between Portland and Seattle held dangers that no amount of horsemanship could fully prepare one for. After finalizing the purchase and arranging for basic tack, Rebecca disappeared briefly to change into more practical traveling attire. She returned wearing a divided riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a jacket that, while still feminine, offered better protection than her previous outfit. "I came prepared for frontier life," she said, noting Caleb's surprise, "even if my accommodations plans went awry." With the mare, whom Rebecca had immediately named Penny, saddled and loaded with Rebecca's modest luggage, they set off toward the northern trail. Caleb set a moderate pace, watching carefully to gauge how his companion handled the ride. To his grudging admiration, she sat her horse with the ease of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, adjusting naturally to the animal's gait and the changing terrain. They rode in silence for the first hour, Caleb leading the way with Rebecca following a few paces behind. The road was well-traveled near Portland, with occasional wagons or riders passing in both directions. Caleb acknowledged these encounters with minimal courtesy, while Rebecca offered friendlier greetings. "Is Seattle much like Portland?" she asked eventually, drawing her mare alongside Storm as the trail widened. Caleb considered the question. "Newer, rougher in some ways, more ambitious in others. Good harbor." Rebecca waited for him to elaborate, and when he didn't, she sighed. "You're a man of few words, Mr. Xanders." "Words are cheap," he replied. "Actions matter more." "A philosophy I can respect," she said, surprising him. "Though I confess I've always found conversation to be one of life's pleasures. A good exchange of ideas can be as invigorating as physical exercise." Caleb glanced at her, momentarily curious despite himself. "What sort of ideas interest you, Miss Neville?" Her eyes brightened at his question. "Oh, many things. Literature. Naturally, I'm particularly fond of Mr. Dickens and Mr. Twain. But also more practical matters. Education reform, the advancement of women's suffrage, the ethical treatment of laborers." She continued, outlining progressive views that Caleb suspected had made her something of an oddity in Boston society. Her enthusiasm was evident, her intelligence clear in the way she articulated complex ideas without pretension. "Those are controversial positions," he observed when she paused for breath. Rebecca smiled ruefully. "Hence my relocation to the frontier, Mr. Xanders. Boston has limited tolerance for women who speak their minds too freely. I'm hoping the West might prove more accommodating to unconventional perspectives." "The West has its own prejudices," Caleb warned. "Different maybe, but just as strong." "Yes, but they're prejudices I haven't yet encountered," she replied with unexpected candor. A fresh start, as it were. Something in her tone resonated with Caleb's own experience. Hadn't he sought the same thing all those years ago? A place where his past couldn't follow him, where he could define himself by his actions rather than his history. "Your uncle," he said after a moment. "He shares your views." "Uncle William," Rebecca laughed softly. "Hardly. He's as conservative as they come. But he's also family, and since my father's death, he's been generous in his support. When he suggested I might find Portland's climate beneficial to my health, a polite fiction, I suspect, to explain my removal from Boston society, I saw an opportunity for a new beginning. And now he's in Seattle." "Yes, on business of some kind." His letter was vague on details, only that he'd be staying at the Olympic Hotel and wished to see me as soon as possible. She paused, then added more quietly, "He's all the family I have left, you see." Caleb nodded, understanding the weight of such circumstances. Family ties were complicated things capable of both anchoring and strangling, sometimes simultaneously. They traveled steadily through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack that Caleb had packed. Rebecca produced some dried apples from her own provisions, sharing them without comment. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Caleb scanned the landscape for a suitable campsite. They'd covered good ground, nearly 20 miles by his estimation, and both horses and riders needed proper rest. "We'll stop there," he decided, pointing to a small clearing near a stream sheltered by a stand of pine trees. "Good water, decent cover." Rebecca nodded, showing no sign of complaint despite what must have been an exhausting day for someone unaccustomed to such travel. As they dismounted, Caleb was surprised to see her immediately begin caring for Penny, removing the saddle and bridle with practiced motions and checking the mare's legs for any signs of strain. "I can manage the horses if you'd prefer to rest," he offered, unloading his own gear from Storm. "I'm perfectly capable," she replied, though without resentment. "And Penny deserves proper care after carrying me all day." Once the horses were settled, grazing on the rich grass near the stream, Caleb set about making camp. He gathered firewood while Rebecca unpacked their provisions, arranging them with efficient practicality. "Have you done this before?" he asked, noticing how she'd positioned their supplies away from the planned fire pit, but within easy reach. "Camping? Not precisely," she admitted. "But I've read extensively about frontier travel. Knowledge may be a poor substitute for experience, but it's better than complete ignorance." As twilight deepened into night, Caleb built a small fire, keeping it controlled to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The flames cast a warm glow over their camp, pushing back the darkness that settled around them. Rebecca produced a small pot and some dried beans from her supplies. "I thought we might have something hot tonight," she explained. "If that meets with your approval." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You came prepared." "I try to anticipate needs," she said simply, setting up the pot over the fire. "It served me well in life." As the beans simmered, an unexpectedly comfortable silence fell between them. Caleb found himself watching Rebecca as she moved about the camp, noting the determined set of her shoulders despite what must have been significant fatigue. There was a resilience to her that he hadn't expected, a practical strength beneath the educated exterior. "How long have you been a courier, Mr. Xanders?" she asked later as they ate their simple meal. Caleb considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. 15 years, give or take, started after the war, the Civil War. When he nodded, she asked, "Which side?" "Union, 71st Pennsylvania." The admission felt strange on his tongue, these details he rarely shared. Rebecca studied him across the fire. "That must have been difficult. You'd have been quite young." "Old enough," he said shortly, unwilling to revisit those memories. "Afterward, staying in one place didn't suit me anymore. The courier work lets me keep moving." "Always in motion," she observed thoughtfully. "Is that freedom or escape, I wonder?" The question struck too close to truths Caleb preferred not to examine. "It's a living," he replied, his tone indicating the subject was closed. To her credit, Rebecca recognized the boundary and respected it, shifting to more neutral topics as they finished their meal. She spoke of books she'd read, places she hoped to see, observations about the changing landscape as they'd traveled north. Caleb found himself listening more than contributing, surprised by how little her conversation grated on him. When it came time to sleep, he arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm a light sleeper," he told her, checking his pistol before setting it within easy reach. "If you hear me move during the night, don't be alarmed. Just stay where you are." Rebecca nodded, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. "I trust your judgment, Mr. Xanders. You've kept yourself alive in this wilderness for 15 years. I suspect you know what you're doing." The simple vote of confidence caught him off guard. Trust was a commodity rarely extended to him, and even more rarely accepted. Yet here was this woman, placing her safety in his hands with remarkable equanimity. "Get some rest," he said gruffly, turning away to hide his discomfort. "We start early tomorrow." As predicted, dawn found them both awake and preparing to continue their journey. Caleb was impressed and somewhat relieved to see that Rebecca showed no signs of complaining about the hard ground or early hour. She moved with purpose, if a bit stiffly, packing her belongings and helping to break camp with minimal fuss. "Sleep well?" he asked, saddling Storm. "Well enough," she replied with a small smile. "The stars were magnificent. I'd forgotten how many are visible away from city lights." The day's travel proved more challenging than the first, as they left the well-established trail for rougher country. The route Caleb had chosen would shave nearly a day off their journey, but required navigating steeper terrain and crossing a river that, while fordable, would test both horses and riders. Rebecca handled the difficulties with determination, following Caleb's instructions precisely when they encountered obstacles. At the river crossing, she guided Penny with confidence, keeping the mare steady despite the swift current. Her skirts were soaked by the time they reached the opposite bank, but she made no complaint, simply wringing out what water she could and continuing on. "You've surprised me, Miss Neville," Caleb admitted as they stopped to rest the horses in the early afternoon. Most city folk would be demanding to turn back by now. She looked pleased at the backhanded compliment. "I'm adaptable, Mr. Xanders, and determined. Useful qualities on the frontier, I should think." "They are," he agreed, "though determination without skill can be dangerous out here." "Which is why I'm fortunate to have a skilled guide," she countered. "I may be stubborn, but I'm not foolhardy enough to believe I could manage this journey alone. Not yet, at any rate." The addition of "not yet" caught Caleb's attention. Most women of her background would view this kind of travel as a necessary hardship to be endured, not a skill to be mastered. Yet Rebecca spoke as if she intended to learn, to become self-sufficient in this harsh landscape. As they continued their journey through the afternoon, Caleb found himself pointing out landmarks and explaining his decision-making more than he normally would. Which route avoided dangerous wildlife territories? How to identify water sources from a distance? Signs of weather changes that might affect their travel, all knowledge he'd accumulated through years of solitary wandering. Rebecca absorbed these lessons eagerly, asking intelligent questions and making observations that showed she was genuinely processing the information. Her interest seemed sincere, not merely polite conversation to pass the time. By the third day of travel, a routine had established itself between them. They rode mostly in companionable silence, breaking it occasionally for Rebecca to ask questions or Caleb to point out something of interest. Evenings were spent establishing camp, sharing a simple meal and talking as the fire burned down to embers. To his surprise, Caleb found himself gradually sharing more about his experiences in the West. Nothing deeply personal, he kept his past before the war firmly locked away, but stories of unusual encounters, difficult journeys, remarkable landscapes he'd witnessed. Rebecca listened with genuine interest, offering observations or questions that showed she was truly engaged. In return, she spoke of her life in Boston, the challenges of being a woman with intellectual ambitions in a society that valued female compliance above all else, and her hopes for what the frontier might offer. There was a frankness to her revelations that Caleb found refreshing, no artifice, no attempt to impress or manipulate, just honest communication. On the fourth night, as they camped in a protected valley with mountains rising majestically on the horizon, Rebecca asked the question Caleb had been half expecting, half dreading. "Why alone, Mr. Xanders? 15 years is a long time to avoid putting down roots." He stared into the fire, considering whether to answer with his usual deflection or offer something closer to truth. Perhaps it was the isolation, the distance from the complications of society, or simply the fact that their paths would soon diverge, never to cross again. Whatever the reason, he found himself speaking with unexpected candor. After the war, everything felt wrong. The world I'd known before was gone, or maybe I was the one who'd changed. Couldn't seem to fit anywhere. Found that moving made it easier to breathe. He paused, adding more softly, "Being alone means no one to disappoint, no one to lose." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, respecting the weight of his admission. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but not pitying. "There's wisdom in that, I suppose. Self-reliance has its merits." "But isn't there also loneliness?" Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with the directness of her question. "You get used to it." "Do you?" she asked, her gaze steady across the firelight. "Or do you just convince yourself that's how it must be?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging assumptions Caleb had built his life upon for 15 years. Before he could formulate a response, a distant sound caught his attention, the unmistakable crack of a rifle, followed by raised voices. In an instant, his posture changed, alert and focused. "Stay here," he instructed Rebecca, reaching for his own rifle. "Keep low and quiet." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he moved silently away from the firelight, blending into the shadows as he sought higher ground to assess the situation. From a rocky outcrop, he could make out a scene unfolding perhaps half a mile distant. A small wagon, stopped on the trail, surrounded by what appeared to be 3 mounted men. Even from this distance, the nature of the encounter was clear, a robbery in progress, with the travelers outnumbered and outgunned. It wasn't his business, not his fight. The sensible course would be to remain hidden, wait for the situation to resolve itself, then continue their journey with appropriate caution. Yet as he watched one of the mounted men drag a figure from the wagon, a woman, from the look of it, Caleb felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the echo of old decisions, old regrets. Moving back to camp, he found Rebecca exactly where he'd left her, though she'd taken the precaution of dousing their fire. "Trouble on the trail," he explained tersely, collecting additional ammunition from his saddlebags. "Robbery, looks like. 3 against 2 with a woman involved." Rebecca's expression grew concerned. "Shouldn't we help? We," Caleb emphasized, "aren't doing anything. I'm going to see what can be done. You're staying here with the horses out of sight." He checked his pistol, ensuring it was fully loaded. "If I'm not back by dawn, take Penny and head back to Portland. Follow the river, it'll lead you straight there. And if you need assistance," she challenged, "I can shoot, Mr. Xanders. My father ensured all his children had that skill." Caleb shook his head firmly. "This isn't target practice, Miss Neville. These men won't hesitate to kill." "All the more reason you shouldn't face them alone," she argued. "At least let me position myself as backup. I won't engage unless necessary, but if things go poorly." The determined set of her jaw told Caleb that arguing would waste precious time. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly, "but you stay at a distance. First sign of serious trouble, you retreat. That's non-negotiable." With a plan hastily established, they secured the horses and moved quietly through the darkness toward the confrontation. As they drew nearer, the scene became clearer. A family traveling by wagon had been stopped by 3 rough-looking men on horseback. The father stood protectively before his wife and what appeared to be a teenage son, while the bandits rummaged through their possessions. "Remember," Caleb whispered, positioning Rebecca behind a large boulder with a clear view of the scene, "stay out of sight. If shooting starts, keep your head down." With that, he moved forward alone, circling to approach from an angle that would give him maximum advantage. Years of solitary travel had taught him the value of surprise and intimidation when outnumbered. Drawing close enough to hear the conversation, Caleb assessed the situation. The bandits were focused on their victims, unaware of his presence. One held the family at gunpoint while the others searched the wagon. "I'm telling you, that's all we have." The father was insisting, his voice strained but determined. "Take it and leave us be." "Don't believe him, Jake," one of the searchers called. "These settler types always got something hidden away. Check under the seat again." Caleb had seen enough. Stepping from the shadows, rifle raised, he called out in a voice that carried clear authority. "That's far enough, gentlemen." The reaction was immediate. All 3 bandits whirled toward him, weapons half raised, caught in the moment of decision between fight and flight. 1 man against 3. The leader sneered, recovering from his surprise. "Bad odds, stranger. Ride away while you can." "I've faced worse," Caleb replied evenly, his rifle unwavering. "Question is, are you willing to die over whatever trinkets these good folks are carrying? Because I guarantee at least one of you won't walk away if this turns ugly." A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. Caleb knew these moments well, the delicate balance when men weighed bravado against survival, pride against pragmatism. The decision came suddenly, predictably. The bandit nearest the wagon raised his pistol with a snarl, but Caleb was faster. His rifle cracked, and the man tumbled from his horse with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 reacted instantly, one firing wildly in Caleb's direction, while the leader spurred his horse toward the family, clearly intending to use them as shields or hostages. It was a dangerous escalation, exactly the scenario Caleb had hoped to avoid. Before he could adjust his position, another shot rang out, this one from behind the boulder where Rebecca was stationed. The leader's horse reared in panic, throwing its rider to the ground with bone-jarring force. The third bandit, seeing his companions disabled and facing fire from multiple directions, made the sensible choice and fled, galloping away into the darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Caleb moved quickly to secure the fallen men. The first was conscious but incapacitated by his shoulder wound. The leader had been knocked unconscious by his fall. "It's safe now," he called to the family, who stood frozen in shock. "They won't trouble you further." As the father rushed to embrace his wife and son, Rebecca emerged cautiously from her hiding place, her father's small derringer still clutched in her hand. Her face was pale but composed, showing none of the hysteria Caleb might have expected from a genteel Eastern woman after such violence. "Good shot," he acknowledged grudgingly as she approached, "though I told you to stay hidden." "He was going to take the boy hostage," she replied simply. "I couldn't allow that." Before Caleb could respond, the father approached, gratitude evident in every line of his weathered face. "We can't thank you enough, sir, madam. Those devils would have taken everything or worse." Introductions were made. The family was named Peterson, heading to a homestead claim near the Washington Territory border, and arrangements discussed for the wounded bandits. It was decided that the Petersons would deliver them to the nearest settlement with a sheriff, adding only a small detour to their journey. "We'd be honored if you'd share our camp tonight," Mrs. Peterson offered once the bandits were securely bound. "It's the least we can do after your bravery." Caleb's instinct was to refuse, to return to their own isolated camp and continue as planned at first light. But Rebecca accepted graciously before he could decline, and he found himself reluctantly joining the Petersons around their larger, more welcoming fire. The evening passed with shared food and conversation, the Petersons eager to express their gratitude through hospitality. Their son, a serious young man of about 16, watched Caleb with undisguised admiration, peppering him with questions about life on the trail. Through it all, Rebecca participated with natural warmth, drawing out the family's story and sharing edited versions of their own journey. Caleb observed her interactions with growing curiosity. She navigated the social dynamics effortlessly, putting the family at ease while maintaining an appropriate reserve. It was a skill he'd never mastered nor particularly wanted to, yet watching her exercise it was oddly fascinating. Later, as the Petersons retired to their wagon and Caleb and Rebecca prepared their bedrolls a respectful distance away, she spoke quietly. "Thank you for helping them. You could have simply avoided the confrontation entirely." Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with her implied praise. "Couldn't just ride away, couldn't you?" she pressed gently. "Many would have. It would have been the safer choice, certainly." He was silent for a long moment, watching the stars overhead. "Some things you can't ride away from," he said finally. "Some choices stay with you no matter how many miles you cover." Rebecca studied him in the faint moonlight, her expression thoughtful. "The war, among other things." He turned away, signaling an end to the conversation. "Get some sleep. We'll reach the main trail to Seattle tomorrow, if the weather holds." The following day brought them to more populated country, with occasional farms and small settlements breaking the wilderness. Their encounter with the Petersons seemed to have shifted something in their dynamic. Rebecca was more confident on the trail, and Caleb found himself less resistant to conversation, answering her questions with increasing openness. By the time they made camp that night, Caleb realized with some surprise that he was actually enjoying her company. Her observations were insightful, her humor unexpected, and her resilience impressive. She had adapted to trail life with remarkable ease for someone raised in Eastern comfort. "Tell me about Seattle," she requested as they sat by the fire, sharing the last of the coffee. What should I expect? Caleb considered, trying to see the frontier city through fresh eyes. It's young, ambitious, built on lumber and shipping mostly, rough around the edges but growing fast. He paused, adding, people there are still figuring out what kind of place they're building. Means there's room for new ideas if that's what you're after. Rebecca nodded, absorbing this. And women. What opportunities exist for someone like me? Depends what you're looking for, he replied honestly. Teaching positions are always needed. Newspapers might take articles from a well-educated woman. Some even run businesses, though that's not without challenges. He studied her across the fire. Your uncle hasn't discussed this with you. A shadow crossed her face. Uncle William has. Traditional views regarding women's roles. He believes I've come west to find a suitable husband and settle into domestic life. And have you? The question escaped before Caleb could consider its propriety. Rebecca's laugh held more resignation than humor. No, Mr. Xanders. I've had ample opportunity for marriage in Boston, had that been my desire. I came west seeking independence, not a different form of dependence. She sighed, adding softly, though I suspect my uncle will be disappointed to learn this. Caleb found himself unexpectedly concerned about her situation. What will you do if he withdraws his support? Adapt, she answered simply. I have some savings, enough to establish myself modestly while I seek employment. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Xanders, only of living a life that feels like a cage. The sentiment resonated with him more than he cared to admit. Hadn't his own choices been driven by a similar fear? The trappings were different societies' expectations of a genteel woman versus the crushing weight of wartime memories, but the fundamental need for freedom was the same. Seattle might suit you then, he said after a moment. It's still finding its character, less rigid than eastern cities. And you, she asked, her gaze direct. Will you continue your solitary journeys after delivering your package? Always in motion, as you said, the question gave him pause. For 15 years, the answer would have been automatic, unquestioned. Of course he would continue. What else was there? Yet now, sitting across from this remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly, the certainty felt less absolute. It's what I know, he answered finally, the closest to honesty he could manage. Rebecca nodded, seeming to understand what remained unspoken. We become accustomed to our patterns, don't we? Even when they no longer serve us well. The insight was uncomfortably perceptive. Caleb busied himself banking the fire, avoiding further conversation on a topic that stirred too many dormant questions. Yet as he settled into his bedroll that night, Rebecca's words echoed in his mind, challenging the foundations of the life he'd built. Their final day of travel dawned clear and mild, the countryside gradually giving way to more settled lands as they approached Seattle. Signs of civilization became more frequent: cleared fields, timber operations, travelers on the road heading in both directions. Caleb found himself oddly reluctant as they crested the final hill overlooking Elliott Bay. The burgeoning city of Seattle spread before them. Wooden buildings clustered along the waterfront, with construction visible in all directions as the city expanded up the hillsides. Ships dotted the harbor, testaments to Seattle's growing importance as a trading center. It's beautiful, Rebecca said softly, reining Penny to a halt beside him. Wild and unfinished, but beautiful. Caleb nodded, seeing the frontier city through her eyes, the promise of it, the potential, rather than just another stop on an endless journey. Your uncle is at the Olympic Hotel, you said. Yes. Though I should perhaps call ahead to ensure he's still there, given the unexpected nature of his travel. They rode into Seattle as afternoon waned, the streets busy with commerce and activity. Caleb led them directly to the telegraph office, where Rebecca sent a brief message to her uncle confirming her arrival. While they waited for a response, Caleb secured rooms at a respectable boarding house nearby, ensuring Rebecca would have proper accommodations regardless of her uncle's situation. The reply came within the hour. William Neville was indeed at the Olympic and would see his niece immediately upon her arrival. The terse message gave no indication of his reaction to her unexpected journey or her choice of traveling companion. "I should go to him directly," Rebecca said, though Caleb detected a note of reluctance in her voice. "He'll be concerned." "I'll escort you," Caleb offered, surprising himself. His delivery to Edward Blackwell could wait another hour. The Olympic Hotel was Seattle's premier establishment, a 3-story wooden structure with aspirations to grandeur, despite its frontier setting. Inside, the lobby attempted Eastern elegance with imported furnishings and carpets, though the effect was somewhat diminished by the muddy boots of its patrons and the faint smell of salt air and timber that permeated everything in Seattle. Rebecca straightened her travel-worn clothing as best she could before approaching the desk clerk. "I'm here to see Mr. William Neville. He's expecting me, Rebecca Neville, his niece." The clerk directed them to a private dining room where, he explained, Mr. Neville was conducting business over a late lunch. As they approached the indicated door, Rebecca paused, taking a steadying breath. "Would you prefer I wait elsewhere?" Caleb asked, suddenly aware that his presence might complicate her reunion. She shook her head. "No, please stay. I would appreciate your support." The simple admission of vulnerability, so at odds with the strength she demonstrated throughout their journey, stirred something protective in Caleb. He nodded, remaining at her side as she knocked firmly on the door. The man who answered was tall and distinguished, with silver-streaked dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His expression shifted from irritation to shock as he recognized his visitor. "Rebecca." "What on earth, how did you?" he broke off, gaze hardening as it shifted to Caleb. "And who is this?" "Uncle William," Rebecca greeted him with composed dignity. "This is Mr. Caleb Xanders, who kindly escorted me from Portland when I discovered you had been called away." "Mr. Xanders, my uncle, William Neville." William's frown deepened. "You traveled alone with a strange man. Rebecca, what were you thinking?" The impropriety, the danger, was considerably less than remaining alone in Portland with no connections or proper introductions, she interrupted firmly. "Mr. Xanders is a courier of excellent reputation who was traveling to Seattle on business. The arrangement was both practical and proper, I assure you." Caleb maintained a respectful silence during this exchange, noting the tension between uncle and niece with growing concern. William Neville was clearly a man accustomed to deference, particularly from women, and Rebecca's independent action had disrupted his expectations. "We will discuss this in private," William said finally, his tone clipped. He turned to Caleb with barely concealed disdain. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Xanders. Your services are no longer required." The dismissal was unmistakable, but before Caleb could respond, Rebecca spoke. "Uncle, Mr. Xanders deserves our gratitude, not our dismissal. During our journey, he not only ensured my safe passage, but also saved a family from bandits at considerable personal risk. He is a man of honor." William's expression suggested he was unimpressed by this endorsement. "Nevertheless, I'm sure he has his own business to attend to." "Don't you, Mr. Xanders?" It was a clear opportunity to withdraw gracefully from what promised to be a difficult family conversation. The sensible course would be to take it, deliver his package to Blackwell, collect his payment, and resume his solitary existence. Yet as Caleb looked at Rebecca, Standing straight-backed and resolute before her disapproving uncle, he found himself reluctant to abandon her so completely. "I do have business in Seattle," he acknowledged. "But I would like to ensure Miss Neville is settled comfortably before I continue my journey." A flash of gratitude crossed Rebecca's face, quickly masked as she addressed her uncle. "I've secured lodging at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house on Front Street. Perhaps we could continue our conversation there, after I've had an opportunity to refresh myself from the journey." William hesitated, clearly torn between asserting his authority and causing a scene in a public establishment. "Very well," he conceded finally. "I have matters to conclude here in any case. Shall we say 2 hours from now?" With arrangements made, Rebecca and Caleb took their leave, walking in thoughtful silence back to the boarding house. The streets of Seattle bustled around them, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding between two people who had been strangers less than a week earlier. "Your uncle seems concerned," Caleb observed carefully as they reached Mrs. Hollister's establishment. Rebecca's laugh held little humor. "A diplomatic assessment. Uncle William is furious that I've disrupted his plans, whatever those might be." She sighed, removing her hat as they entered the boarding house foyer. "I apologize for involving you in family discord." "No need," Caleb assured her. "I should deliver my package now, but—" He hesitated, uncertain how to express what he was feeling. "If you need assistance or simply conversation, I'll be staying at the Frontier Hotel tonight. My business concludes tomorrow." The offer hung between them, more significant than its simple words suggested. For 15 years, Caleb had avoided entanglements, connections, responsibilities toward others. Yet here he was, deliberately extending his presence in Rebecca's life beyond what circumstances required. "Thank you," she said softly, understanding in her eyes. "I may take you up on that offer." With a nod of acknowledgement, Caleb departed, his thoughts in unusual turmoil as he headed toward Edward Blackwell's office. The package delivery went smoothly. Blackwell was expecting him and had the payment ready, but Caleb found himself distracted, his mind repeatedly returning to Rebecca and her situation. After securing a room at the Frontier Hotel, he spent the remainder of the afternoon attending to practical matters, arranging for Storm to be properly stabled, purchasing supplies for his next journey, cleaning his weapons. Yet underlying these familiar routines was a nagging sense of incompleteness, as if a decision remained unmade. Evening found him in the hotel's modest dining room, absently picking at a meal he barely tasted. He had just decided to retire to his room when a commotion at the entrance caught his attention. Rebecca stood in the doorway, scanning the room with obvious agitation. When her gaze landed on Caleb, relief washed over her features. He rose immediately, concern evident as she hurried to his table. "What's happened? May I join you?" she asked, her voice controlled despite her evident distress. When he nodded, she sat, removing her gloves with hands that trembled slightly. "I've had an enlightening conversation with my uncle." Caleb signaled for the waiter to bring coffee, giving Rebecca a moment to collect herself. When they were alone again, he asked simply, "Bad." "Illuminating," she corrected, managing a wan smile. "It seems Uncle William has arranged a marriage for me to a business associate of his, a Mr. James Harrington. 48 years old, twice widowed, and by all accounts a difficult man, but wealthy and well-connected in Seattle's developing society." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Without your knowledge or consent?" "Oh, he assumed my consent was unnecessary," Rebecca replied, an edge of bitterness in her tone. "After all, I'm merely a spinster of 26 with no fortune of my own and rapidly diminishing prospects. In his view, I should be grateful for his intervention. And when you declined, Caleb guessed. Rebecca's laugh held no humor. He informed me that my passage west was paid with Harrington's money as a sort of advance on the arrangement, and that my options are to honor the agreement or find myself completely without support in a city where I know no one and have no connections. Anger flared in Caleb's chest, unexpected in its intensity. That's unconscionable. It's pragmatic from his perspective, Rebecca said, though her calm tone was belied by the tension in her posture. And not entirely unexpected. I knew Uncle William viewed my progressive ideas as a liability to be managed. I simply didn't anticipate how thoroughly he planned to manage them. Caleb studied her across the table, noting the determination beneath her distress. "What will you do?" She met his gaze directly. "I won't marry Harrington, that much is certain. As for the rest—" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I have some savings. Enough to sustain me while I seek employment. Seattle needs teachers, you said. Or perhaps a newspaper might value a correspondent with Eastern connections." Her courage was remarkable, facing complete abandonment in an unfamiliar city with nothing but determination and intelligence as resources. Caleb found himself both admiring her resolve and concerned for her welfare. Seattle, for all its opportunities, could be unforgiving to those without support. "You have options," he said finally, "more than your uncle believes." Rebecca tilted her head, studying him curiously. "Such as?" Caleb hesitated, weighing words he never expected to speak. "I'm heading north after this delivery. There's good money in carrying messages between the logging camps and settlements along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Less dangerous than some routes, decent communities." He paused, then added quietly, "You could come along, at least until you decide your next move." The offer hung between them, as surprising to Caleb as it clearly was to Rebecca. For a moment she said nothing, her expression unreadable. "As what, Mr. Xanders?" she asked finally. "Your traveling companion. Your assistant. She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "As someone finding her own way," he clarified quickly. "I know the territory. Can introduce you to people who might offer work more suited to your abilities than whatever your uncle has planned. No obligations beyond that." Rebecca's expression softened, understanding dawning. "That's very kind. But wouldn't I be a burden to someone accustomed to solitude?" The question struck at the heart of Caleb's own confusion. By all logic, yes, her presence would disrupt the carefully constructed isolation he'd maintained for 15 years. Yet the days spent in her company had awakened something he'd long suppressed. The simple pleasure of human connection, of shared experiences, of not being entirely alone in the world. "I found your company unexpectedly tolerable," he admitted, the closest he could come to expressing the tumult of his thoughts. A smile tugged at Rebecca's lips. "High praise indeed coming from you." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "I need time to think. This is not what I anticipated when I came west." "Take all the time you need," Caleb assured her. "I'll be here until morning." Rebecca nodded, rising from the table. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders, not just for the offer but for—" she gestured vaguely, "for seeing me as capable of making my own choices. It's rarer than you might imagine." After she departed, Caleb remained at the table, nursing a whiskey and contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. 1 week ago, he would have laughed at the suggestion that he'd invite any woman, let alone an educated Easterner with progressive ideas, to accompany him on his journeys. Yet here he was, hoping she would accept. The realization was unsettling. 15 years of carefully maintained distance from human attachment, undone by a chance encounter and a few days of shared travel. He told himself, It was merely practical concern for someone in a difficult situation, nothing more. But the hollow feeling at the thought of resuming his solitary existence suggested otherwise. Sleep proved elusive that night, his mind circling between worry for Rebecca's situation and confusion about his own actions. By dawn, he had reached no clarity, only the certainty that he would honor whatever decision she made. He was checking Storm's tack in the livery stable, preparing for departure regardless of the outcome, when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Rebecca standing in the entrance, a small valise in hand and determination written across her features. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble. Caleb straightened, waiting silently for her to continue. "I won't be accompanying you north," she said, her voice steady. "But I would like to propose an alternative arrangement." Something cold settled in Caleb's chest. Disappointment, he realized with surprise. He nodded for her to continue, maintaining a neutral expression. "I met with Mrs. Hollister this morning," Rebecca explained. "She's a widow who has built this boarding house business herself, quite successfully. When I explained my situation in general terms, she was sympathetic. She's offered me a position managing her establishment while she opens a second location across town." "That's good news," Caleb said, genuinely pleased for her despite his own confused emotions. "Respectable work with lodging included, I imagine." "Yes," Rebecca agreed. "And it allows me to establish myself independently while learning the practical aspects of business management. Eventually, I might be able to invest in my own establishment." Her enthusiasm was evident, her relief at finding a path forward palpable. Caleb pushed aside his unexpected disappointment, focusing instead on her success. "I'm glad you found a solution that suits you. Your uncle—" Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. "Has been informed of my decision. He's displeased, to put it mildly, but ultimately powerless to force the issue without creating a public scandal. Mr. Harrington, it seems, is less enthusiastic about the match now that his prospective bride has demonstrated such unseemly independence." "Their loss," Caleb observed, earning a grateful smile. "Indeed." Rebecca hesitated, then continued more softly. "There is one aspect of my arrangement with Mrs. Hollister that I wish to discuss with you. She has connections throughout the region and receives regular correspondence that requires secure delivery. Currently, she uses various means to send these messages, but she's expressed interest in establishing a more reliable system." Caleb raised an eyebrow, beginning to understand. "A courier?" "Yes," Rebecca confirmed. "Someone trustworthy, experienced with the territory, capable of handling sensitive communications." She met his gaze directly. "I suggested she might wish to engage your services, at least for her more important deliveries. It would mean regular work in this region, with Seattle as a frequent starting point." The implication was clear. An opportunity for Caleb to maintain his independent lifestyle while establishing a more stable connection to a specific place and to her. It was a thoughtful compromise, respecting his need for freedom while offering something he hadn't realized he might want: a reason to return. "That's a generous offer," he said carefully, "but my usual routes take me much further afield. I'm not sure I'd be the right fit for local deliveries." Rebecca studied him, a hint of challenge in her eyes. "Is it the work that draws you so far, Mr. Xanders, or the distance itself? 15 years is a long time to run from whatever you're trying to outpace." The observation cut closer than she could know. Caleb turned back to Storm, adjusting a strap that needed no adjustment, buying time to compose his thoughts. "Some distances can't be measured in miles," he said finally, the admission more honest than he'd intended. Rebecca moved closer, not touching him but near enough that he could sense her presence. "I understand that better than you might think. We all carry burdens from our past, but perhaps the weight becomes lighter when shared, even a little." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, seeing the strength and compassion in her face. In that moment, he recognized what had drawn him to her beyond her intelligence or resilience, a fundamental understanding of what it meant to seek one's own path, regardless of expectations. "I could consider a more regional circuit," he conceded, "for the right client." Rebecca's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Mrs. Hollister would be delighted to discuss terms whenever you're available. She's a fair businesswoman." An understanding passed between them, unspoken but clear. This was not merely about courier work or business arrangements. It was an opportunity, tentative, undefined, but real, to explore whatever connection had formed between them during their journey. "I have one more delivery scheduled," Caleb said. "North, as I mentioned. Should take about 10 days round trip." He paused, then added, "After that, I could return to discuss terms with Mrs. Hollister." "I'll inform her," Rebecca replied, her tone professional though her eyes conveyed deeper meaning. "She'll be pleased to have such a reliable courier available." As they stood together in the quiet of the stable, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and leather, Caleb felt something shift within him, a loosening of old constraints, a willingness to consider possibilities long abandoned. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, just the first tentative step toward something new. 10 days isn't so long," Rebecca observed softly. "No," Caleb agreed, "not compared to 15 years. The days of Caleb's northern journey passed with a strange mixture of familiar routine and newfound anticipation. The terrain was challenging but beautiful, the delivery straightforward, the solitude less comfortable than it had once been. For the first time in memory, he found himself looking forward to returning to a specific place, to a conversation with a specific person. Seattle welcomed him back with its usual bustling energy, the harbor busy with ships and the streets filled with the commerce of a growing city. Caleb made his way directly to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, where he was greeted by the proprietress herself, a practical woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Mr. Xanders," she said, extending her hand with businesslike efficiency. "Rebecca spoke highly of your reliability. I'm pleased you've returned to discuss our proposition." The meeting that followed was refreshingly straightforward. Mrs. Hollister outlined her needs for regular courier services between her establishments and various business associates throughout the region. The work would provide a steady income while still allowing Caleb the independence he valued, with Seattle as his primary base of operations. "I believe we can establish a mutually beneficial arrangement," Mrs. Hollister concluded, satisfied with the terms they'd negotiated. "Rebecca will coordinate your assignments as she's managing most of our correspondence already. Speaking of whom," she glanced at the clock, "she should be returning from errands shortly. Perhaps you'd like to wait in the parlor." Caleb accepted the suggestion, settling into the modestly comfortable room to await Rebecca's return. Through the window, he watched the everyday life of Seattle unfold: shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, children playing in side streets, women with market baskets exchanging greetings. Ordinary scenes that had always seemed to belong to a world separate from his own. The sound of the front door opening caught his attention, and moments later Rebecca appeared in the parlor entrance. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly arranged, looking every inch the capable business manager. Yet when she saw him, her professional demeanor gave way to genuine warmth. "You came back," she said simply. "I said I would," Caleb replied, rising to greet her. Yes, you did. Her smile held a hint of teasing, though I half expected you might reconsider the merits of civilization during your journey. It has its advantages, he admitted. Decent coffee, for one thing. Rebecca laughed, the sound brightening the room. A compelling argument indeed. I trust Mrs. Hollister has discussed the business proposition. She has. Terms are agreeable. Excellent. Rebecca hesitated, then asked more personally, "And where will you stay when in Seattle?" "Mrs. Hollister has rooms available for regular boarders, if that would suit you." The question carried implications beyond mere lodging arrangements. To accept would mean establishing a more permanent connection to this place, to these people, to her. It was a significant step for someone who had deliberately avoided such ties for 15 years. Yet as Caleb looked at Rebecca, he recognized that something fundamental had already changed. The solitude he had once embraced now felt emptier, less like freedom and more like absence. The prospect of regular returns to Seattle, of conversations by the fire, of sharing observations and ideas with someone who actually understood these had become more appealing than the isolating silence of the trail. "That would be convenient," he said finally, "for the work." Rebecca's eyes crinkled with amusement at his deliberate understatement. "Purely practical considerations, of course." "Of course," he agreed, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. In the weeks that followed, Caleb established a new pattern to his life. Regular courier routes took him throughout the region, carrying correspondence and occasional valuable items for Mrs. Hollister and her growing network of business associates. The work maintained the independence he valued while providing the structure of regular returns to Seattle, to the boarding house, where Rebecca managed operations with impressive efficiency. Their relationship evolved gradually, built on mutual respect and shared conversations. Evening discussions by the parlor fire became a ritual when Caleb was in residence, ranging from Rebecca's observations about Seattle society to Caleb's increasingly detailed accounts of his journeys. Slowly, cautiously, they began to share more personal stories: Rebecca's struggles against the limitations imposed on women in Boston, Caleb's complicated memories of the war and its aftermath. "I couldn't save them all," he admitted one night, finally giving voice to the burden he'd carried since Gettysburg. "My unit was positioned at the stone wall during Pickett's charge. We held, but the cost." He stared into the fire, seeing faces long vanished. "My brother was there, 2 different regiments, same hellish day. He survived, but something in him didn't. When we returned home, he just faded, couldn't adjust to peace." Rebecca listened without interruption, offering the gift of complete attention. When he fell silent, she asked softly, "Is that why you left? Because of your brother?" Caleb considered the question more honestly than he ever had before. "Partly. Watching him struggle made my own difficulties seem selfish somehow, but it was more than that. Everything felt wrong after the war, too confined, too ordinary, too much like pretending the world hadn't changed irrevocably." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "So I left, kept moving, convinced myself it was freedom when maybe it was just another kind of prison. And now?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle but direct. "Is it still a prison?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple words. Caleb thought about the past months, about the unexpected comfort he'd found in returning to Seattle, in knowing Rebecca would be there, about how her presence had somehow made the silences less empty and the world less stark. "No," he answered finally. "Not anymore." Their courtship, for that was what it had become. Though neither had formally acknowledged, it progressed with the same measured pace as their friendship. Seattle society raised eyebrows at the spinster manager who spent so much time in conversation with the taciturn courier. But Mrs. Hollister's approval provided sufficient respectability to quell the worst of the gossip. Spring arrived, bringing new growth to the forests surrounding Seattle and new developments in their relationship. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront after delivering a particularly valuable package to a ship's captain, Caleb found himself contemplating a future he'd never imagined possible. "I've been offered a partnership," Rebecca announced as they paused to watch the sunset over the harbor. "Mrs. Hollister wants to expand her business to Tacoma and has proposed that I manage the Seattle operation as a junior partner rather than an employee." "Congratulations," Caleb said warmly, genuinely pleased at her success. "You've earned it. Your management has improved the business considerably." "Thank you." She hesitated, then continued more carefully. "It would mean more responsibility, of course, more permanence in Seattle." Caleb understood the unspoken question behind her statement. Their current arrangement, his regular departures and returns, had served them well as they built trust and understanding. But at some point, decisions about the future would need to be made more explicitly. "Permanence has its merits," he observed, watching a ship tack against the evening breeze. "If it's the right place, with the right people." Rebecca turned to face him fully, her expression earnest in the fading light. "Is Seattle the right place for you, Caleb, after all your years of wandering?" It was a question he'd been asking himself with increasing frequency. The courier work still satisfied his need for movement and independence, but the solitude between destinations no longer felt like freedom. Instead, he found himself looking forward to his returns, to the moment when Rebecca would greet him with that particular smile she reserved just for him. "It's not the place," he said finally, finding honesty easier than it had once been. "It's who's there, who's waiting." Color rose in Rebecca's cheeks, but her gaze remained steady, and if someone were waiting, hoping for something more permanent than regular visits between journeys. Caleb took her hand then, a gesture that had become natural over the months, but now carried deeper significance. "I rode alone for 15 years, he said quietly. "Told myself it was what I wanted, what I needed. Then a stubborn woman from Boston disrupted my carefully constructed solitude, and now—" He paused, searching for words adequate to express the transformation. "Now, I can't remember what that solitude ever tasted like. Can't recall why I thought it was freedom." Rebecca's eyes shimmered in the twilight. "Is that your roundabout way of saying you might consider a more settled existence? Perhaps with a business partner who could manage affairs when you need to travel?" "It might be," Caleb acknowledged, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Though I suspect this business partner would have strong opinions about how things should be run." "The strongest," Rebecca agreed, her own smile widening. "But she would value her partner's perspective and experience, and she would always be waiting when he returned from necessary journeys." The proposal for that was what it was, in its own way hung between them, an offer of partnership both professional and deeply personal. Caleb considered it with the careful deliberation that had kept him alive through 15 years of solitary travel. "I'd need my own space," he said finally. "Can't abide being crowded." "Of course," Rebecca replied, understanding his need for occasional solitude. "The boarding house has several private apartments for long-term residents, or perhaps eventually a small house near the water. And I'd still need to ride out sometimes," he continued. "Some messages need delivering in person." "I would expect nothing less," she assured him. "Your reputation for reliability is valuable to our business, our business." The simple phrase carried such weight, such promise of shared future. Caleb felt something shift within him, the final surrender of a defensive posture he'd maintained for too long. "Then yes," he said simply. "I accept your proposal, Miss Neville, in all its aspects. The joy that illuminated Rebecca's face was worth every moment of uncertainty, every fear he'd confronted in opening himself to this possibility. When he leaned forward to kiss her there first, despite months of growing closeness, it felt like crossing a threshold into territory both unknown and somehow, paradoxically, like coming home. Their wedding, 3 months later, was a small affair held in Mrs. Hollister's garden. The older woman had embraced their partnership with practical approval, recognizing the business advantages as well as the personal happiness it promised. A few friends from Seattle society attended, along with the ship captains and business associates who had come to respect both Rebecca's management skills and Caleb's reliability. As they exchanged vows beneath an arbor of climbing roses, Caleb marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the solitary rider who had entered Portland with plans to deliver a package and depart immediately, to a man willingly binding his life to another's, the transformation seemed both impossible and inevitable. "I take you, Rebecca Neville, as my wife," he said, the formal words carrying the weight of his private promise, "to share in all aspects of life's journey through whatever terrain we may encounter." Rebecca's answering vows were equally heartfelt, her green eyes steady as she pledged herself to him, not as a destination, but as a companion along the path we create together. Later, at the modest reception, Mrs. Hollister raised a toast to the new partners in business and in life. "To Rebecca and Caleb," she proclaimed, her practical nature softened by genuine affection. "May your union prove as successful as our business venture and considerably more pleasurable." The laughter that followed broke any remaining formality, transforming the gathering into a true celebration. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away to the small house near the water that they had purchased together, Caleb's gold from years of courier work, combined with Rebecca's savings and first profits from her partnership stake. It was a modest dwelling, but it offered both the comfort Rebecca valued and the breathing room Caleb required. Most importantly, it was theirs, a shared space that belonged to neither and both, a physical manifestation of the life they were building together. Standing on the porch as sunset painted the waters of Puget Sound in gold and crimson, Caleb wrapped his arm around his wife's waist, still marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "Having second thoughts?" Rebecca asked, leaning into his embrace. "About settling in one place after so many years of wandering," Caleb considered the question seriously, as was his habit. "Not second thoughts," he said finally. "More like appreciation for how paths change. For 15 years I convinced myself solitude was all I needed. Freedom from attachment, from responsibility to anyone but myself." He gazed out at the water, the distant mountains. "Now I can't recall what that solitude tasted like, can't imagine choosing it over this." Rebecca turned in his arms, studying his face in the fading light. "You're a different man than the one I met in that Portland hotel room." "As you're a different woman than the one who arrived from Boston," he countered gently. "We've changed each other." "For the better, I think," she murmured, resting her head against his chest. "For the better," Caleb agreed, holding her close as darkness settled around their new home. In the years that followed, their partnership flourished in all its aspects. The business expanded under Rebecca's management, with Caleb's courier services forming a reliable foundation for more ambitious ventures. Their personal life developed a comfortable rhythm. Periods of shared domestic tranquility interspersed with Caleb's necessary journeys, each return a small celebration of their ongoing choice to build a life together. 2 children joined their family, first a son, William, named in a gesture of reconciliation toward Rebecca's uncle, who eventually, grudgingly, acknowledged the success of her unconventional choices. And later a daughter, Emily, whose adventurous spirit matched her father's while her intellect clearly favored her mother. Caleb never entirely lost his need for occasional solitude, for the open trail and star-filled nights away from civilization's constraints. But these journeys changed in character no longer an escape from connection, but a temporary absence that made returning more meaningful. And sometimes, as the children grew older, the entire family would accompany him on shorter expeditions, camping beneath the vast northwestern sky while he taught them the skills that had kept him alive through 15 years of wandering. On one such evening, as Rebecca and the children slept nearby, Caleb sat watching the dying embers of their campfire. 20 years had passed since that fateful delivery to Portland, since the chance encounter that had altered the course of his existence. His hair was streaked with silver now, his face more deeply lined, but the restlessness that had once driven him relentlessly forward had been transformed into something more purposeful. Rebecca stirred, awakening to find him still vigilant. She moved to join him by the fire, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the night's chill. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked softly, mindful of the sleeping children. Caleb nodded, drawing her closer. "About journeys, destinations. How sometimes what you're running from isn't as important as what you're running toward, though it takes a while to realize the difference." Rebecca smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light. After all their years together, she had become adept at translating his philosophical musings. "And what were you running toward, my love, in all those solitary years?" Caleb gazed at their sleeping children, then at the remarkable woman beside him, still strong-willed, still intellectually curious, still the perfect complement to his more taciturn nature. "This," he said simply. "Though I didn't know it then, couldn't have imagined it. I'm glad you found it," she murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. "Or perhaps that it found you." As the stars wheeled overhead and his family slept peacefully around him, Caleb Xanders, once the epitome of the solitary traveler, acknowledged the profound truth of his journey. For 15 years, he had ridden every mile alone, convinced that solitude was freedom and connection was constraint. Then Rebecca had entered his life, challenging his assumptions and offering a different kind of liberation. Now, with the warmth of his wife beside him and their children sleeping nearby, he couldn't remember what that solitude had ever tasted like, and he had no desire to recall it. The lone trail had led, against all expectations, to home,